Hello, good morning to all. Bom dia. We are here starting one more session of CEBRI Online. I'm Tatina Rosito, Senior Fellow at CEBRI and Coordinator of China Analysis Group. Today we have the pleasure to receive Chen Long. Chen Long is a co-founder and partner at Plenum Research in Beijing. And he's a Beijingian himself. It's a pleasure to have him today because we are the title of our session, China Back to Normalization, the twin sessions and the way ahead for 2020 is very much in line with the increase of the dependency of Brazilian economy, specifically Brazil's exports on China. What are the twin sessions? The twin sessions are the sessions, one of the most important political events every year in China. They usually convene in the beginning of March up to mid-month. This year, they have been postponed to May. They started on May 22nd and finished last week. They are why the twin sessions, they happen at the same time, the session of the National People's Congress or the Chinese legislative body and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, where you have, it's a consultative body where you have the representation of all sorts of people in society, from sports people to flagship entrepreneurs, to also representatives of different minorities, and all sectors of activity, also of economic, social, cultural activities in society. So they have concluded last week. And why they are important for us, why they are important for the world, they are important for us because they are important for China. That's usually where the Prime Minister will read and have approved his work report, and also where they will set targets for policy targets for the year ahead. So this year, I think it was no surprise, Chen will talk more about that. They scrapped the target for GDP. There were also major issues treated, for example, the issue of a national security law for Hong Kong, also the inaction of a new civil code, labor and market reforms. So they will all be very important issues for China, together with the macroeconomic, financial and other policies to deal with the pandemic, and also specific policies for increasing and strengthening governance along the way. Those have all very important economic and political implications. And also what happened in Brazil during this first 5 months of the year is that our exports to China increased, and by May, they reached, from January to May, they accounted for 33% of Brazilian exports. In May alone, they represented 40% of Brazilian exports. So amid the pandemic, we have seen very important resilience of the Brazil-China trade. It grew from January to May over 15%, while our trade and exports to other parts of the world have declined, in general, have declined sharply. So China is getting even more important in trade flows and the complementarity issue. And so without further ado, I will pass on to Chen Long. Chen, it's a pleasure to have here today. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. It's my first time talking to the group at CEBRI, and I feel very honored. And before I start, I want to wish everyone stay safe and healthy during this special period. I mean, I kind of experienced that a few months ago, and it's very difficult, but going to have belief and confidence that these things will go over and eventually will be overcome, and then hopefully our lives will be normal again. So I will talk about a few things about in today's presentation. So the title of it is called China After COVID-19 and NPC, the National People's Congress. And what I'm really going to cover is several grounds. One is what China's economic recovery has been looking like since the bottom of the COVID, and what NPC has talked about, how Chinese policymakers have decided to stimulate the economy. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics on Hong Kong as well as the United States. Right. First, please allow me to make a brief introduction about our firm. Plenum is very new, independent research firm. I founded a few of my fellows last year, and after a few years, I worked at GapCal. And so we try to bridge Chinese politics and economy. So I believe probably we are the independent research firm that's more politics on policy side than any other firm there on the street. And we try to combine that with economic analysis. And the team, I mean, it's purely Chinese. It's Chinese, a few of us, but we are based in different parts of the world. I'm in Beijing, another guy in Shanghai, another in Hong Kong, another in Washington usually, but he's now in Toronto. And if you want to have more information, you're welcome to click www.plenum.ai to find more information. And you could find some reports from us. So Chinese economy is really bottoming out after the 6.8% contraction in Q1, and that's unprecedented. We've never seen anything like that. Even in global financial crisis, Chinese economy still managed to grow. And look at the high frequency data. So where are we since the end of March? So we've been on a steady track of recovery, although it's not 100% normalized yet. So my favorite one is really this chart on the left-hand side is the subway passenger volume in 30 largest Chinese cities. And this is daily. And I use the scale is the passenger traffic level of that day as a percentage of 2019 average daily level. So as you can see last week, that's June 1st. In the whole country, we're about 85% back to the normal level of last year. And in the south, we're a little bit better. In 18 cities in the south, it's about 90%. And in some cities like Shenzhen, the one next to Hong Kong, and Hangzhou, very close to Shanghai, it's already more than last year's traffic volume. But in the north, we're a little bit lag behind. In the north 12 cities, we're about 75% of last year's level. And Beijing, we're about 70%. So the south is a little bit more ambitious and aggressive in the reopening process, while the north is relatively lag behind. But I think in a few weeks, we're probably going to be back to almost 100% level and following just the previous trend. And the other high frequency data we look at is the daily thermal coal used by 6 largest power groups in China. They're all state-owned. And finally, starting from early May, we're seeing year-on-year growth of the daily coal use at 6 power groups turn positive for the first time. And this is consistent with the monthly economic data published by the NBS on the electricity usage in the country. That last month was the first month that it turned positive. And based on this number, I think in May, we're going to see a little bit better than April, right? And the trend is still recovering. While at the bottom of the crisis, I mean, really the end of February, early March, we're almost minus 40% from a year ago. And now we make quite a big comeback. And the other indicator we look at, of course, is housing. I mean, housing is still the most important sector in China. And again, we look at high frequency data, daily property transactions in 30 largest Chinese cities, and I divided them into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And now we're about back to flat year-on-year growth in terms of volume, square meters transactions. And at the worst of the cycle, we're almost down 90% year-on-year. And you see it took about 3.5 months to come back to zero growth. And so the May data will probably be better than April, because in April, it's still minus 15 to 20%. And now by the end of last week, it was about flat. And this is, again, consistent with the national data. And this is a monthly basis that property sales in April was still minus. But I think in May, when the data came out in 2 weeks, we're going to see that turn positive again. And this trend will probably continue as a lot of local governments come with policies to support property purchases, as well as loosen up the hukou restrictions. Hukou is a household registration system in China that usually a large city would only allow people to buy the property in the city if you have that city's hukou or you paid Social Security in that city for a few years. So if you give more people a hukou of that locality, that means more people are entitled to buy properties in the city. And it's been a very quite popular policy of Chinese local governments to use when they want to adjust the property market. So we're probably going to see a little bit further upward momentum in the property market in the next few months as well. And automobile, the other very important sector for China, we had a big plunge in the first quarter, which is unsurprising because everyone had to stay at home. And actually, Chinese car market was growing at 26 years in a row until 3 years ago. 2017 was the last year it still managed to grow year on year. And then 2018, it had a decline. 2019, it was a smaller decline, but still, again, it's a decline. And this year, a lot of people actually initially thought we're going to have a turnaround because last year there was a policy shock that there's an emission standard change on a lot of the old cars. So people didn't want to buy the old car and they want to wait for to buy the new car. So people thought 2020 was a big chance, but unfortunately they got the COVID and got a big decline. And at the worst of the cycle, again, late February, early March, it was down about 90% year on year. And now we're coming back. And last month, we're turned positive for the first time. And in May, they just announced a preliminary data that it was up 11%. And I think car sales will probably stay positive for a few more months afterwards. So we're already back to the normal level for cars and properties. But for some sectors, we have not yet fully normalized. For example, investment. It is coming back. It is bouncing up from the bottom. And actually, even at the worst, it was not as bad as cars or properties, because cars or property, they were down 80%, 90% in Q1. And for investment, they were only down about 30% at the worst. And it's now bouncing back a little bit. But again, the scale is much smaller than the rebound in cars and housing because people expect the policy support. But so far, the policy support was not as big as a lot of people would otherwise wish to happen. And also, infrastructure's importance in the Chinese investment is still big, but we should not overstate the importance because the number one largest share in the Chinese fixed asset investment is still manufacturing. It's about 30% of total investment. And then you have infrastructure, about 25%, and the real estate and infrastructure about neck to neck, both about 25%. And then you have other services about 20%. So even if there is a big launch of infrastructure spending, it's only part of the total investment. And we have to consider what's going to happen in manufacturing and real estate before analyzing what the infrastructure stimulus means. And for now, it looks like the stimulus is more focused on property and manufacturing rather than infrastructure. And the worst sector so far is still the household. We did estimate that we think we're facing some 20 million job losses this year. Total urban employment in China is 530 million. And this does not include this nearly 300 million rural migrant workers. And these are urban people live or working in urban employers. And the largest employer is manufacturing, about 120 million. And we expect that some of that job will be lost, about 9 million. And the accommodation catering services, this is the sector that get hit the hardest of the hotels and restaurants that people still reluctant to go. And even for now, I mean, a lot of the restaurants in Beijing, for example, usually you have to queue up for 1 hour, 2 hours, and now you can just walk in very easily. So their business is still not back to normal yet. And we expect that in a way, they still have to pay the rent and they don't have enough service. So they have to cut about 8 million people. So in total, about some 20 million people will be lost. And we already seen that in the data that employment PMI is plummeting and household income growth was barely positive in Q1, but household consumption was almost minus 10%. And even if we expect some rebound in Q2, I think the consumption will still be in negative territory. And while income will probably grow a small positive. So instead of a so-called revenge spending many are hoping for, we're actually seeing a revenge saving. Saving rate is going up. And because of the uncertainty, people really cannot spend a lot when they don't know whether the job is still safe in 6 months or 12 months time, right? And I suspect this might be the case not just for China, but throughout the world. I mean, I know a lot of countries, especially in advanced economies, that give money to people and or some of the cover their salaries. In the UK, 80% of the salaries are covered. In US, Japan, parts of Germany, I mean, the governments give money directly to people. But I don't think the people would dare spend all the money all the time because they don't know whether this program will be over and whether they'll be able to find a job when the program is over. So expect a saving rate increase in almost everywhere in the world. But surprisingly, one thing China does really well and beat expectations of everyone, including myself, is exports, right? Because look at all the other indicators. It shows Chinese, there's no way Chinese exports should do well. PMI was plummeting, was very bad. And we also compare Chinese export with the other regions in Asia. South Korea, Taiwan are the things we look at most closely. But usually they follow the same lines. The black line is South Korea, Taiwan export, year-on-year growth. And the red line is Chinese export. So usually they grow in the same direction. But they started to diverge a little bit last year. And this year we again see a diverge. Chinese export was positive in April, while the rest of Asia was, especially Korea, Taiwan, were plummeting. And this is also not consistent with the consumer confidence collapsing in Europe and US. And then we look at the breakdown of export. It looks like a lot of them have to do with COVID, right? A big increase is textile goods, and that includes a lot of medical gears, masks, etc. And also a personal computer is another item that increased massively, and also some semiconductors. So that probably related to people working from home. And the latest news is Chinese bicycle export to Europe increased by tenfold into Spain or Italy or France. And this is, and people say the reason is people still don't want to take public transportations, which is why I choose to look at the subway passenger volume, because you could say that the road is very jammed because people want to take cars, but it's only normal when people start to willing to take public transportation, right? So now what we're seeing in some parts of Europe and US is, they want to buy more bikes because they don't want to contact other people. And that's also somewhat surprisingly helped Chinese export and may start continue to beat expectations, right? So what Beijing has done so far is a little bit different from other countries. So most countries from the fiscal perspective launched a massive rescue plan for both households and corporate segment, right? For household, usually they give money directly to people, and for companies, they also give money very low interest rate to people. And in some countries like US, they started to buy, they agreed to buy corporate bonds, although Fed hasn't really bought a cent so far. So that kind of restored market confidence. But in China, there's very little policy directly targeted households. I mean, Beijing didn't come with any policy to give money directly to people, although I prefer that. We have instead is some waves of corporate social securities, a little bit cut of electricity prices, some VAT waivers, and some more increase of central government and local government bond issuance. And as a consequence, we're gonna see the fiscal deficit increase in the budget. They say it's 3.6%, but on a cash basis, it's really going to be 7%. And once we include the special purpose bonds, both from central government and local government, it will be easily over 12%. And if you include SOEs and local government financing vehicles, as the IMF does, I suspect this number will be 15% or even higher. So this is a pretty big fiscal spending after all, but they came out in a sequence, right? In February, they announced a little bit. And in March, they announced some little bit more bond issuance. In April, they said, okay, we're going to increase more bonds. And then in May, they said, at the MPC, Li Keqiang said all the waves of corporate contribution of Social Security would be extended from 5 months to 11 months, right? So it comes in the sequence. And monetary policy is similar. I mean, China, the PBOC cut rate only marginally. We had a few cuts of 7-day reverse repo and the LPR. If you look at this chart, in total about 30 bips. And this is nothing compared with the scale of rate cuts in other countries. I mean, except the ECB and BOJ, which already have negative rates or zero interest rate. I mean, most other countries, the US, even India, I mean, Brazil as well, they also cut interest rate massively by over 100, 150 basis points in the policy rate. In China, 30 bips, not so much. But I would say this is misleading. because 30 bips rate cut does not reflect the scale of Chinese easing. Because if you look at the borrowing cost, look at the government bond yield decline, is over 100 bips. This is a 5-year CGB, and then the 5-year corporate bonds also declined by over 100 bips from late 2019 to early to last month, before a little bit bounced back recently. And thanks to the record low level of corporate bond borrowing costs, we saw a big increase in corporate bond financing in the interbank market. I mean, last 2 months, each month, the net issued over 900 billion RMB. That's a record level. And the most important chart, if you want to measure Chinese stimulus, is probably this chart on the left-hand side, which is China's total credit growth. Is the credit given to all the non-financial sector in China, including government, both central and local, all the corporations, including both SOE, state-owned enterprises, and private firms, as well as households, and look at the year-on-year growth of the stock. Right. So in 2009, of course, this was a massive, great stimulus that total credit growth was growing at 35% year-on-year, and we had two smaller stimulus in the last decade. In 2012-13, there's a pickup total credit from 15% to 22. 2016, from about 11-12% to 16-17%. That's the last Chinese reflation, many of you will probably remember, puts up commodity prices as well as housing prices. At this time, we really had credit growth hanging around at 10-11% for 2 years in a row now. But now I think we have very clear signal that this is going to pick up, because in the government work report, Li Keqiang said the year-on-year growth of aggregate financing and broad money supply, which is M2, should be notably higher than last year's. Last year growth was 10%, and he said it has to be notably higher. Previously, all the expressions are, okay, we want to keep total credit growth to be more or less in line with nominal GDP growth, and could be a little bit higher, because they still stick to this deleveraging agenda, which was the dominating policy from late 2017 to early 2020, to early this year. Actually, this should be the last year of the deleveraging campaign. So you see, as a result, Chinese total leverage was basically stay stable, and it dipped a little bit over the past 3 years, no increase, unlike what happened from 2009 to 2017. Right, we have stabilizing of leverage, no matter which indicator you look at, BIS, my calculation, or just aggregate financing. Right, but this year, I think notably higher means something at least 3 percentage point higher. Because if it's just 1 percentage point, I don't think it's notable. Right, so maybe it's 3 to 4% higher of credit growth, and based on that, I think total leverage in China will rise from 250% to over 280%. It's a big jump this year. Which I would say, does that mean all the deleveraging campaign in the last 3 years are in vain? I would not say that, because otherwise you will only see leverage being even higher today. Because at the time of coronavirus crisis, governments in the world, around the world, have no choice. You can only tell the banks to keep lending to firms, keep lending to households, because they just don't have enough cash flow to repay, and you also have to increase demand. This is the worst time to have austerity policy, is during a crisis. And I think no government in the world has a choice but to allow leverage to be higher. And I think the deleveraging campaign in the past 2 years kind of bought China a little bit more time. But otherwise, the trajectory will be very scary and will make the next cycle in the next few years very, very dangerous. Right. And a little bit on the investment conclusion, usually the Chinese rates and bond yields follow the credit growth. When we see credit growth start to pick up, you will see rates, no matter interest rate swap or bond yields, will start to pick up again. So one of my strongest convictions is China rates will start to pick up. And I also think the FX market, of course, partly is driven by the yield spread. If you look at yield spread between China and US, actually it's pointing to a very good scenario of renminbi appreciation from now. Because now it's the yield spread really pointing to 6.6 to 6.7, and now we're nearly 7.2. And even from the basket perspective, the CFED index has been around 92 to 97 for several years, since 2016. And now we're about 93, a little bit lower than 93. So it's near the bottom. And I think once that happens, we'll probably bounce back. So it's probably a good time to sell dollar CNY as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about politics. And so one of the biggest consequences of the coronavirus is, I think President Xi Jinping has really strengthened his power again. I've seen some op-ed pieces on media such as Financial Times. Some people say she is a big loser. This is totally nonsense. I think she is a big winner, if anything, because first of all, he was able to consolidate the power. He was able to put the blame on local officials, right? So the Communist Party secretary in Hubei province and Wuhan city, in the center of the epidemic, they were fired, and they still were not appointed a new job. And so he was able to shift the blame from the central government to local governments, and also he did one unprecedented thing, is to spoke directly to 170,000 officials nationwide via video conference in late February. This never happened ever in Chinese history. I don't think it ever happened ever in the world. But that basically means she was talking directly to people all the way down to county. But in Chinese system, you have central government, you have provinces, you have municipalities and cities, and then you have the counties. China has over 3,000 counties. So she was directly talking to county party secretaries. That's the grassroots of the regime. And he was able to do that. That means, and 170,000 people were listening to one guy at the same time. This is, I would say, unimaginable. So if he is able to do that, that means he's centralizing his power. And the other one I think make him look good is when the response is from the West, particularly the United States. I mean, so basically the more people, the more infections and deaths the United States report, it means that, you know, she is doing very well. I mean, because the gap will only widen throughout the time with over nearly 2 million people infected in China. Even if, say, you don't believe the official number, you don't believe it's just 80,000, let's say you think it should be doubled, 160,000, or say it should be tripled, doesn't matter, because the United States has 1.6 million, right? There's no way China has 1.6 million. Wuhan just did the coronavirus test and found about 300 people symptomatic infections, and that's 10 million people, right? So there's no way we really have that many infections, and that makes she looks very good. And I think that strengthens his power. And then a little bit about, he's pushing back a little bit on reform, or brought up reform on some factor market, especially data technology, but they are very important. In China, everyone now must present a health QR code on a smartphone when you enter, when you take a train, when you take a plane, or you go to a shopping mall, even you go to a restaurant, you often have to show your code. And if the code is green, that means you're fine. And if it means it's red, that applies to people who came from Wuhan. They identified high-risk places, low-risk places, and mid-risk places. So if you're a red code, you couldn't do anything. You have to stay at home, and no train, no airline, no train will allow you to take that. And if you're yellow code, you have 7 days, red code 14 days, you're only green code, you can move freely. So that's the Chinese way of responding. Of course, I mean, this is tracking people's movement to unprecedented level. But she saw this as very effective and very efficient. And the other one, I'll talk a little bit about Hong Kong, is the national security legislation. I expect some people will ask questions. I would say the timing is interesting because I think the reason is Hong Kong is going to have the legislative council election in September. And I think that's why Beijing wants to bring that up at the end of May, because then it has time to pass it. Either by the end of June or by the end of August, because the National People's Congress Standing Committee meets every 2 months or 6 times a year. And if they meet twice, they could pass the law by end August, and the law will be effective, we put in the basic law, and then whoever violates the national security law in Hong Kong will be disqualified from the election. So I think the main purpose was to make sure the electoral election goes as smoothly as possible. And opposition from the West, especially from the US and UK, I don't think it matters. Because there is really nothing US can do. The so-called special status only matters to about, Hong Kong now only export to goods about $400 million to Hong Kong, or to the US. And in the US, they report 3 billion. So either 3 billion or 400 million doesn't really make a big difference. And then the other special treatments are including a lot of bilateral treaties. And for example, they include double taxation avoidance. So if the US say, no, we're not going to recognize the double taxation acknowledgement, means American citizens in Hong Kong will have to pay both Hong Kong tax and US tax. And that hurts Hong Kong, hurts the Americans much more than Hong Kong people, right? So I don't think Washington would even do that. And we already seen the news that most of the business in Hong Kong, both local business, Chinese business, and British business, HSBC, Standard Chartered, Jardine, Swire have all come out say to support the legislation. So I think it will be passed fairly soon, and nothing will really happen to shake Hong Kong's status. But of course, having said that, U.S.-China tensions will continue to escalate, and it has expanded from trade to technology, COVID politics, the blame against each other, financial market, and geopolitics, Hong Kong and possibly Taiwan. But I think on the trade front, it's still relatively safe. China is buying a lot more agricultural goods than last year, and also it's getting close to the 2017 level. So I think that China is doing everything it can to deliver the trade agreement. But of course, because of coronavirus, no service trade will happen, and very little energy purchase will happen because oil prices are record low. So China will not be able to deliver the whole trade commitment purchases. But China, I think, will do everything it can, try to stabilize the relationship. And I also don't think Trump will walk away from the deal directly, because I don't think he gets benefited very much from the election if he does that. So I think that's the end of my presentation, and I'll leave as much time for Q&A as possible. And yeah, back to Tatina.
Thank you. Thank you, Chen Long, for this very interesting and deep analysis of the Chinese economy. It's really a pleasure to hear from someone that can match so much both the economic and the political analysis. We had at the beginning of our session over 100 people with us, and I hope they are still with us. I'll kickstart the Q&A with 2 questions for you, and then I'll move to questions from participants. So one issue is the scrapping of the GDP target growth. Do you expect it to be something that will hold for 2020, or this is also an opportunity to change this target, to move to a different sort of target? What do you expect from there? And the second question is about Hong Kong. There are some analysts that say that the decision actually to move ahead and finally adopt a national security law in Hong Kong, which is something missing from the basic law, it really expresses not only the desire to stabilize the region, but to double down in terms of Hong Kong as a global financial center, Asian financial center. Do you agree with that? And do you think this is so, or also this new move, let's say, of having Hainan as a free zone trade port has something to do? Is it possible to think of tropical Hainan as a new financial hub, or should we look over to Shanghai and Shenzhen in the future? What is your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Tatiana. First question is about GDP growth target. There are a lot of speculations right now, but I fear, I don't think there's a consensus formed in Beijing's policymakers yet. There's a guy from NDRC spoke in a press conference a couple of days ago, and he was one of the guys who drafted the plans. And basically he said he thinks it's still good to have a GDP growth target afterwards, because he thinks that gives people a benchmark and gives local governments a benchmark for people how to think about managing the economy. So according to him, that there should be a growth target after COVID. But I think from even higher level people, nobody has really said or expressed any opinion on GDP growth target. And in fact, if you ask President Xi himself, he would say, I have been saying quality is much more important than quantity for many years. But President Xi himself is not a strong proponent of GDP growth target. So I think a lot of that will depend on how China recovers from it, how the world recovers from it. And next year, growth will be very tricky, because this year you got a big bottom in Q1, and then the next year will probably benefit from a little bit of the base effect in Q1. So we're going to see massive growth, 20-30% growth in next Q1, and then a big slowdown afterwards. So I also think it's a little bit hard to manage next year's growth as well. And also, I think it depends on, I mean, why this year's growth was so important for many people was because this is the last year in so-called building the moderately prosperous society, right? There's a 20-year growth target that China in 2020 GDP per capita should quadruple the level of 2000, right? So that's why a lot of people eye on that. And if according to that number, it should be 5.7%. And we're not going to reach that. And Xi Jinping is saying we're fine if we don't reach that because we have reached all the other aspects of building moderately prosperous society. And we'll probably make that next year. So he doesn't really care that much. So it really depends whether he will come up with another longer term plan. Let's say the 5-year plan will come up next year. And then what's he going to say, whether he's going to put a number in the 5-year plan for the next few years. Actually, we're going to see the plan by the end of this year. So we'll probably get a little bit more clarity on the growth target. And Hong Kong, I think really Beijing, there's no way Xi will allow this can happen in the second year, right? Because basically it's now solved, and he has to make sure Hong Kong is still under control. And he wants Hong Kong to be prosperous, so there's no way he wants to diminish Hong Kong, but he wants Hong Kong to be under control, right? And he thinks there's a strong view that Beijing's way of handling Hong Kong last year was very bad. And as a matter of fact, the top Chinese officials handling Hong Kong affairs were fired. In the beginning of the year, in January, the top official at the liaison office of central government in Hong Kong was replaced. She put a semi-retired official called Luo Huining. He was formerly party secretary of Shanxi province in charge of anti-corruption campaign. And he was also party secretary of another big province. So he's a local government official and a very senior level official. But he was 65. Usually he would retire. But she brought him back again and put him in charge of Hong Kong affairs. Previously, since the handover in 1997, all the liaison office top officials were in the same small circle, right? They all from the same system. They've been dealing with Hong Kong, Macau affairs for their career. So Luo Huining is an outsider. And she obviously thinks the previous team did a very bad job. And then in February, he replaced Luo Huining's boss. Right? The state director of Hong Kong, Macau affairs was replaced by a guy called Xia Baolong, who was President Xi's deputy in Zhejiang province 15 years ago. So when President Xi was party secretary of Zhejiang province in Hangzhou, that's where Alibaba is based, Xia Baolong was his deputy party secretary. So Xi put 2 of his very trusted officials in charge of Hong Kong affairs earlier this year. And we thought that was a very strong signal that he wants to do something different from last year, and he wants to push harder. But at the same time, I think China has a very strong interest because there's a lot of mainland business in Hong Kong, and China also wants to make sure both foreign business and Hong Kong local businessmen are still fine, give them security in dealing with Hong Kong affairs. And also, I think there's a division among the businessmen themselves. And some people, they probably don't like Beijing's intervention, but they also feel like the violence last year, the riots, were not great for business, right? Because Hong Kong's GDP has been shrinking for 4 quarters in a row, but this never happened. Even Asia financial crisis, Hong Kong managed to recover after 3 quarters. This is 4 quarters already, and probably get even worse. So businessmen actually, they want stability as well. So I think they easily accepted this approach, and that's why all the Hong Kong local businessmen, as well as British business, they already said they're going to support the national security law. And another thing I think worth pointing out is Beijing still wants to recognize the importance of judiciary independence in Hong Kong. Right? The Hong Kong High Court has a mix of judges. There are at least 16 foreign judges in Hong Kong High Court. A lot of them are Americans, some are British, some are Australian. This is, of course, not usual for a region to have foreign judges in the High Court. But Hong Kong does have that. And this is a lot of people in the mainland criticize that because they think that's foreign interference. But again, officially, Beijing doesn't want to touch that because Beijing, I think, fully understands the rule of common law system and the independent judiciary system are the most important thing for Hong Kong as an international financial center. So you can change the national security law, but they don't want to touch the judiciary system. So I think they still recognize the importance of Hong Kong and they want Hong Kong to be prosperous.
Oh, That's very interesting, Chen. I have a couple of questions on sustainability and environment. So we have noticed few analyses maybe saying that this is not so high in the agenda anymore, of course, due to the slower growth and the pandemic. But and how could and of course there is still increasing consumption of coal. How this could affect the car manufacturing, and a second question also on how does Chinese investors themselves deal with environmental sustainability and governance issues? How do they view that inside China?
Unfortunately,
inside or outside, actually.
Yeah. I think Chinese investors haven't really picked up that idea of ESG investment. I mean, that's very, very blunt. I don't think anyone, I know it's a big deal in the West. To my knowledge, I haven't heard any Chinese investor actively talk about that, at least in China, because the market itself is very strong. It's very cyclical. There are a lot of heavy industrials, a lot of coal, and I know there are some people saying, no, they're not going to invest in coal companies. But if you're not going to invest in coal companies, China produces half of the global coal. So if you don't invest in coal companies, I mean, you don't know what to invest. So that's not really discussed in China so far. And maybe it will get a little bit stream afterwards, but not yet. On car manufacturing, I don't think it's affected very much. Cars are still very important for China, especially for local governments. China sold 225 million cars last year, and it probably get a little bit less this year, but still is the world's largest car market. And China is pushing very hard on new energy vehicles. So that itself, so I don't think on the environmental side, there's any plan to remove car manufacturing or whatever. Yeah.
But that said, would you agree that so this is more of a top-led issue, that environmental targets will continue to be very important and to be implemented very stringently, even at the local level?
Yes. I mean, actually, it has become one of the most important evaluation metrics for local government officials. So usually in the province, there are about 10 to 12 cities, prefecture level cities, and the province will do a ranking of pollution reduction level in your state. Because each province has let's say the whole province, we're going to cut, let's say the AQI, air quality index, has to fall by 5% this year. They're going to do a ranking of the 10 cities. And the one who ranked the last will get a warning in the party, which means you get a very slow promotion afterwards. So this is very important for local government officials already. Yeah.
I do have a couple of questions on FDI, both FDI in China, and so what would be? We see that China has been doubling down FDI, trying to attract more investment. What will be the role for FDI, and also the future for China's central position on supply chains? And then on the other hand, also, how do you see the environment for Chinese overseas FDI in the post-COVID scenario?
Yeah, I think for FDI, the inward investment, Beijing, I think is valuing that more than ever, because they recognize there's a tendency of deglobalization, decoupling, driven by Washington, and China doesn't want that to happen. So it's trying hard to persuade and to show to other firms or other countries that China is still a reliable place to invest, and it's pushing very hard on stabilizing global chains as well. Because this year they started to mention is so-called the 6 stabilities and 6 insurers, and one of the insurer is on top of that is ensuring employment, and then right after that is ensuring supply chain stability. And then they have started to assign senior local government officials as the head of supply chain. So which means you maybe in your city there's I use one example. There's a city called Ganzhou in southern China, and the city is very famous for rare earths and also very famous for furnitures, right? And the party secretary of that city took the role of the head of the furniture supply chain. So he has to try to talk to the furniture manufacturers frequently to make sure that the furniture supply chain stays in the city. And this is now becoming popular throughout China. So it's doing very hard to stabilize supply chain. And for outside investment, or outward investment, it will probably take a hit I think partly because, after the COVID, China will probably have to waive a lot of the foreign debt China lent to other countries, and then because of the economic slowdown or crisis, they couldn't even repay the debt, and China will have to settle a resolution, and it will probably discourage some of the outbound investment. Also, I mean, a lot of the investment is really political driven, right? If the leader goes out to other countries, meet the president of other countries and have agreement, and usually he's accompanied by some big companies and Chinese and CDB or Exim Bank. And if that trips don't happen, usually you see that the direct investment doesn't happen either. And also, of course, you get the investment restrictions already allowed in the US, much more in the EU, much more in Japan. So even if China wants to make investment in certain sectors, China is not able to. So I do think ODI, actually Chinese ODI was already declining a little bit before COVID. And after COVID, I think we'll probably not go back to the peak level either.
Chen, we also have been following with interest the issue of, let's say, factors of production reform, and most importantly, like you mentioned, the hukou, and also hukou. And for Brazil also, the effect of this in agricultural reforms and agricultural production is very important. How do you see the effect of hukou in urbanization, and also this? Do you see also huge effects in maybe one more wave of agricultural reform? Let's see more consolidation, increasing productivity. How do you see this going forward?
I think hukou reform is a big tool to push forward urbanization. And also it is a backdoor easing of property market as well. Because for China, I mean, there's a big slogan on the top that the housing is for living, not for speculating. And this is said for President Xi Jinping himself. So no city could ease property policies by, they don't want to ease purchase restrictions, and they couldn't increase the leverage for mortgage. And some cities have done that, and they withdraw the policy, easing policies within a couple of days. So what they do instead is, okay, I'm going to give a lot more hukou so that existing people can now buy more housing, but we get a lot more new people, and they could buy apartments. And this being encouraged actually by Beijing. So this is the urbanization / backdoor easing on property is happening in big scale in China. And they already said all the cities with less than 3 million people would have to completely scrap hukou restrictions. And then those between 3 to 5 million would have basically scrapped restrictions. And those, even some very large cities like Wuhan, for instance, Wuhan is making it very easy for college graduates to get a hukou in that city. And that will attract usually a lot of people in the same province. So that will have a big impact on urbanization. But on agricultural side, I think very little is happening because China still doesn't allow a rural land transfer or rural land consolidations. Basically, I think for ideology reasons, and that doesn't want to hurt the stability of the regime. So I think on that side, nothing big will really happen.
Thanks. Still on this issue, because we have had actually this has been, as I mentioned in the beginning, agricultural exports have held very high even through the pandemic, and Brazil and China are very important. Actually, Brazil is the largest agricultural, let's say, import origin for China. About 20% of agricultural exports come from Brazil. I'm not sure if you follow specifically like the markets for like soybean and corn from Brazil. This is an important issue for also the production of meat there. By the way, both exports of soybean and beef have reached historic highs for Brazil in May. How do you have any comments on that, on like the future imports of agricultural goods from China in view of issues like food safety and food security? Any comments on that?
I mean, on soybean, I think 80% of Chinese demand come from other countries. Brazil is very large. US was also pretty large. and some wheat or something from Russia, Ukraine. So for this, like they call it commercial agricultural commodities, I mean, China's reliance is huge, and this is now going to get smaller, and it's only going to get bigger. But China does hold a strong line on rice. I think rice is probably the only agricultural commodity that China wants to make sure we have enough domestic supply. And on other fronts, I mean, China first cannot, and secondly has also just no measure or no policy to push for such a change. So it just has to accept it. Yeah.
That's good news for us. But so going now forward to some more global and international issues and the role of China, I have a couple of questions on the future for like Belt and Road. How do you see this initiative going forward in a post-pandemic world? We have also noticed a much more assertive tone of China's foreign policy in the COVID, both as some analysts label wolf warriors, or is it really just those are isolated movements? Is it sort of maybe a new guidelines, new red lines? How do you see this more assertive and abrasive, I could say sometimes, Chinese foreign policy going forward, and how this could impact the Chinese image for business?
Yeah, I think in the foreign ministry, there are two factions at least. One, those who are based in Beijing, they're a little bit more hawkish, a little bit more assertive, especially under the spokesman you mentioned, Zhao Lijian, the so-called wolf warrior. He's only a mid-level official. He's I think he's a vice departmental level, so he's not very senior, right? So the top of that, so in China's foreign, maybe I make a little bit brief introduction about China's foreign policy. Unlike most countries, right, foreign minister usually ranks number 2 or number 3, at least top 5 in the cabinet, right? In China, the ranking is much lower, right? So on top, you have the Politburo standing committee, that's 7 people. And Vice President Wang Qishan, you could say count him as the number 8. And then the whole Politburo is about 25 people. And this administration, the first time in 20 years that put State Councilor, former Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi in the Politburo. So he is the top person in charge of Chinese foreign affairs. And he is one of the 25, and he's not one of the top 8. So his ranking is probably somewhere between number 10 to number 20. And so you could see the top person in charge of Chinese foreign policy is much lower ranking of that in other countries. So usually it's top 3 or top 5. And then lower that, you got you got the Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and then you get the deputy ministers and some big ambassadors, and then you get a departmental level, and then you get guys like Zhao Lijian. So he's really mid-level, and he's fighting for promotion. And he gets this idea that some leaders probably want a more aggressive tone because, I heard people, some leaders not very happy when they see English media hammering China all the time, or U.S. Politicians hammering China all the time on Twitter or whatever. So there's a view in the foreign ministry that we should become a little bit more aggressive in fighting back. So we want to fight back. We don't want to just be a punk back, let them punch us all the time. And I think Zhao Lijian was trying to implement that kind of idea to fight back. Meanwhile, you have a different faction, just like our ambassador to U.S., Cui Jiankai. He's relatively more dovish. He wants to smooth the relationship. He wants to talk things down. He doesn't want to make a flare. So this is really, I think, what's going on in China at the moment. And there are different views, there's different factions. And we shouldn't really be surprised. Don't think this China is a country that, the president's there and everything is centralized. Yeah, it is centralized in very big matters. But after all, there are 90 million party members. And in the system, there are 20,000 vice departmental level officials above, and they could some have opinion, and it could be supported by some part of the factions, right? So that's possible, and I think they're just trying to fight back. But of course, And a lot of that is about domestic propaganda, not really to show to the West or other countries, but to show domestically, say, now, we are fighting back very hard. Don't think we're weak, we're very strong. So it's a lot of what the foreign ministry are doing is for internal audience, not so much for external audience. And for Belt and Road, I think this is one of the top agenda for the president, and I think he'll continue to push forward that after coronavirus, because this is really that reform that he wants to make it important. Yeah, and especially when the U.S. continues to, try to isolate China, and I think the Belt and Road was a chance for him, to promote China's own friends.
So you think he will still push for it?
Yes,
in a post-pandemic. Okay.
Maybe even harder.
Interesting. Yeah. I think we are going to in our final minutes. I do have one domestic question again, which I think is important. You have also in your research, I think one very important, interesting aspect has been to really show us this relationship between central and local governments. How in the Xi has been present, she has been able to consolidate power, but at the same time, you need things moving, at the local level. How do you see this in terms of this pushing expenditures now, the new bonuses, and how to have this control in terms of this back and forth control in terms of disciplining local governments? And the question tied to that is, do you have any, let's say, guess for growth estimate for 2020?
This year?
China? Yeah.
I think we'll probably grow somewhere like 2%, or a little bit higher. So I don't know where that sits in the market. I know IMF probably says 1% or 1.5%.
Yeah,
I'm a little
1.2 or something.
Yeah, I think we're getting a little bit momentum in recent months, and probably continue into Q3. Maybe we get a little bit of a dip in Q4. But I think we maybe get a little bit over 2%. And now central-local relationship, but right now, the relationship is local government completely rely on Beijing. On big policy agendas, they have to wait for policy signals from Beijing, from either President Xi or Premier Li Keqiang or other people, right? I'm not sure whether you mentioned this. So now the recent initiative is to renew the informal economy, right? To let people go out on the street, open the night market, to sell goods on the street. And this is something Chinese government was strongly against for many years. Tatina must know this, and for other people who have not been to China, there's Chinese, it's called this urban city management team, they're called Chengguan, and they would, basically their job is to stop people from selling stuff on the street, and to make sure street is clean and nobody does business, and if you want to do business, you'll do it in your shop, right? And now Premier Li Keqiang said last week that I love the street market. I love the night market, and this is lively, and this is good for business, it's good for employment, and we should allow that to happen. And then overnight, suddenly we find there are already 20 provinces, we're going to put forward that, and people come with plans to do that. And some even give the Chengguan, the city management people, tasks to bring out people to set up stuff on the street, which is completely opposite from their previous job. Right, so this is really very top-down driven, and whenever there's something from Beijing, the whole government will fight to follow that, so this is really the new reality. Yeah.
All right, I have one also final question, because I know that when Vice President Moran went to China last year, you were part of a group that spoke to him on China.
Yeah.
So you somewhat
I had the luxury, yeah.
Yeah. So so it's you follow Brazil somewhat, and maybe you have been following. What is there any change in view in China or in circles? How do you see this, like, more recently since the COVID started? Or this is, you don't see as an issue at all, like in terms of bilateral relations, if any, like, changes?
Not yet, because the focus so far is really about a lot of attention will pay to the U.S. And I think on Brazil, first of all, I feel very sad that now the new cases in Brazil, I think, is #1 in the world. There are a lot of news coverage about the fight between President Bolsonaro and local officials and the governors, how the governors oppose President Bolsonaro's approach to keep the economy open. And a lot of people compare, of course, President Bolsonaro with Donald Trump. I'm not sure that's a good comparison. So I think that's most of the coverage is about, how, the central local dynamic in Brazil is making the COVID response a little bit harder than it should be.
Sure. Okay, Chen Long, it has been really our privilege to have you today. We had, I'm not sure how many, but over 100 people with us today. We wish also you keep safe there, and wish you a lot of success to you and Plenum Research House in the future. We hope to keep in contact and have more conversations like that in the future.
Yes, please.
I also thank all our participants. Do you want to say to have any final say?
Yeah, I would just, again, thanks for participating in this forum. And if you have questions, actually, you could reach out to me directly if you want. My email, can I show that?
We actually are going to, I forgot to say that we are going actually to hand out your presentation. We are going to send to all people that registered.
Yeah, that's great. But otherwise, you could see that on the screen too. It's chen@plenum.ai. So it's very easy to find me.
Okay, thank you, Chen Long, and thank you for all people that have been with us, both in Zoom and YouTube. And keep safe and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye, John.
Bye-bye.